One minute he was just waiting for his luggage. The next, he was being treated like a suspect. But this officer picked the wrong man to mess with. Los Angeles International Airport was its usual chaos. Gate changes blaring over the intercom, kids crying, business travelers glued to their phones, and exhausted vacationers dragging suitcases behind them. Omari Qasim had just stepped off a 5-hour flight from Dallas, a little stiff from sitting so long but relieved to be back in California. He wasn't the type to complain, though. He had a good life. At 38, he was the co-founder of a fast-growing tech firm specializing in cybersecurity, a name people in the industry were starting to recognize. Not that it mattered much in a place like this. Here, he was just another traveler, blending into the sea of people shuffling toward baggage claim. Or at least he thought he was. That was until he noticed the cop. Near the entrance to baggage claim, Officer Grant Kearney stood with his arms crossed, eyes fixed on Omari like he was casing a suspect. A white guy in his late 40s, stocky build, standard TSA law enforcement uniform. Nothing unusual about him, except the way he stared, like he was waiting for Omari to slip up. Omari had seen this before, too many times. He checked his phone and ignored it at first. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe Kearney was looking past him. But a minute later, when Omari reached the carousel for his flight, he glanced up again. Kearney was still there, watching. Not the guy in the wrinkled suit next to him, not the teenagers goofing off with their backpacks half open, not the man in cargo shorts pacing while ranting into his AirPods. Just him. All right. Fine. He let out a slow breath and shook his head. It wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, and it wouldn't be the last. But then, Kearney started moving. Straight toward him. Omari's grip tightened around the handle of his carry-on as the officer stopped a few feet away, standing too close for a casual interaction. "Can I see some identification?" Kearney asked, his voice clipped and official. Omari blinked. "Excuse me?" Kearney's eyes narrowed. "I need to see your ID." "For what? You've been standing here for a while," Kearney said. Omari let out a short, incredulous laugh. "So has everybody else. We're all waiting for bags." Kearney's expression didn't change. "Just show me your ID." There was a choice here. Omari could comply, hand over his ID, and let this guy flex his authority like he had the right to question him for existing in an airport. Or he could do what he knew he should do. Push back. He tucked his phone into his pocket. "Is there a reason you're asking me for it and nobody else?" Kearney's jaw tensed. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Ah, there it was. Omari crossed his arms. "You want to tell me what description that is?" A long pause. Then, "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way." The hard way. Right. Because asking a question was resisting. Omari wasn't a fool. He knew how this could go. Push too hard, and things could get ugly. Stay silent, and Kearney walks away thinking he can do this to the next person. And the next. The question was, how far was Kearney willing to take it? But before Omari could decide, someone else made the choice for him. A voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, officer. Is there a problem here?" Omari turned. A woman in a dark green blazer stood a few feet away, phone raised. And just like that, everything shifted. For a split second, Officer Kearney hesitated. His stance stiffened, his gaze flickering toward the woman with the phone. Omari, however, recognized her immediately. Miriam Cho, award-winning journalist, investigative reporter, and the last person any law enforcement officer wanted recording them. She didn't lower her phone. "I'm just making sure everything's handled fairly here," she said, her voice cool but firm. Kearney exhaled sharply, like an inconvenient fly had just buzzed into his space. He turned back to Omari, irritation creeping into his expression. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time. Show me your ID." Omari held his ground. "You still haven't told me why," he said, keeping his voice steady. "And if I really fit a description, you should have no problem explaining what that is." The energy in the terminal shifted. The background noise of baggage claim, the hum of conveyor belts, rolling suitcases and distant chatter, faded under the weight of growing silence. Other passengers started noticing. A middle-aged black man in a navy hoodie, a young woman with bright red headphones slung around her neck, a white couple near the baggage carousel. They were all watching now. Some discreetly pulled out their phones. Kearney felt it. His fingers twitched at his belt near his radio. He had a choice too: back down or escalate. His ego wouldn't let him pick the first. He reached for Omari's wrist. "All right, turn around." But Omari took a step back, hands raised just slightly, not aggressive but clear. "You're trying to detain me? For what crime?" Miriam's voice rang out again. "You might want to reconsider that, officer. You have about 6 cameras on you right now." Kearney's head snapped in her direction, his face shifting from authority to irritation. "Ma'am, this is a law enforcement matter. Stay out of it." Miriam didn't blink. It became a public matter the second you singled him out without cause. More voices now. Not loud, but enough to make it clear. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. A woman nearby spoke up. "Yeah, why is he the only one being questioned?" "I saw the whole thing," a younger guy muttered. "He was just standing here." Kearney's face tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Usually when he exerted control, people complied. They lowered their heads, answered his questions, showed their papers, made it easier for themselves. But not today. Omari saw it in his eyes, the realization sinking in. Kearney had miscalculated. And then, just as the tension teetered on the edge, a new voice entered the scene. "Officer Kearney." The firm, authoritative tone came from behind. Kearney turned, and so did Omari. A man in a grey blazer and airport security badge strode toward them. Rodney Finch, Airport Security Director. A name Omari recognized, though they'd never met in person. Finch's eyes moved from Kearney's stiff posture to Omari's composed but tense stance, and then to the crowd gathering nearby, phones still recording. He understood the situation immediately. His gaze hardened. What exactly is going on here? And just like that, the tables started to turn. The tension crackled in the air, thick enough to choke on. Officer Kearney's posture turned rigid, his jaw tight as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He knew Finch outranked him in this setting, but the frustration simmering beneath his skin was hard to contain. Omari, on the other hand, remained still, his heart steady. He wasn't going to gloat, wasn't going to smirk, because this wasn't over. Not yet. Finch's sharp gaze flickered between them. "Kearney, I asked you a question. What's the issue here?" Kearney hesitated. He knew how this looked, but backing down, not an option. "This individual was acting suspiciously," he said, voice clipped. "He was lingering near baggage claim, and when asked for identification, he refused to comply." Omari let out a breath through his nose. "I refused because you singled me out for no reason. I was standing here just like everyone else, waiting for my bag." Finch's expression darkened. He'd been in airport security long enough to know when a situation had gone sideways. And this was bad. He turned to Omari. "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience. Are you waiting for a checked bag?" Omari nodded once. "Yes. Do you have your baggage tag?" Without a word, Omari pulled out his phone, scrolling to the digital copy of his baggage receipt. He held it up. Finch glanced at it, then turned to Kearney. "Did you ask for this?" Finch asked, his tone dangerously even. Kearney's nostrils flared. "I asked for ID." Finch's stare hardened. "Did you ask for his baggage claim receipt?" Kearney didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Finch exhaled sharply and turned to Omari. "You're free to collect your bag, sir. I appreciate your patience." Omari could have left it at that. Could have just taken the out and walked away, but something in him refused. "This keeps happening," he said. His voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. "And the worst part? Guys like him never think twice about it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the small crowd. Finch nodded slowly. "I understand your frustration." "No, you don't." Omari met his gaze, steady and unblinking. "But you could try." Silence. Kearney's face burned red, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Omari wasn't looking for an apology. Not from him. He glanced at Miriam, whose phone was still recording. "Do you have everything you need?" She gave a slow, knowing nod. Kearney felt it now, the weight of real consequences. The public eye was on him, and in this era, that mattered more than a badge. Finch exhaled through his nose, choosing his next words carefully. "I'll be reviewing the footage, Officer Kearney. We'll have a conversation later." Omari didn't gloat. He didn't need to, because the shift had already happened, and Kearney knew it. Kearney stood stiff as a board, his face a shade darker than before. Whether from anger or realization, it didn't matter. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it, but letting go wasn't in his nature. "You're making a mistake," Kearney muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Finch to hear. Finch's expression didn't change. "The only mistake I see is an officer using his badge to harass someone who was minding his business." A few people in the crowd murmured in agreement. A woman nearby whispered something to her friend, shaking her head. Someone else let out a low, disapproving whistle. Omari had seen things like this before, but he'd never been on this side of it. Usually the system protected its own, not today. Miriam stepped forward, lowering her phone slightly, but still keeping it recording. "Officer Kearney, do you have a statement you'd like to make for the record?" The way Kearney's head snapped toward her, she might as well have slapped him. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His mouth opened, then closed. His jaw flexed, but what could he say? Anything that came out of his mouth could and would be used against him. Finch didn't let the silence hang for long. "Kearney, you're dismissed. Report to my office after your shift." Omari could see it. The way Kearney's pride and training were at war inside of him. The instinct to keep control battled with the cold, hard fact that he had none left. For a second, Omari wondered if he'd push back, dig his heels in and make things worse for himself. But he didn't. Kearney took a slow step back. Then another. His eyes flickered to Omari, something like resentment flashing through them. Omari held his gaze, not in anger, not even in triumph, just recognition. This moment would stay with Kearney longer than it would stay with him. Without another word, Kearney turned and walked away. The second he was gone, the energy shifted again. Someone let out a breath they'd been holding. A man in a plaid shirt chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. A woman in a leather jacket muttered, "About time." And just like that, the crowd began to scatter. Omari rolled his shoulders, exhaling slowly. The tension that had gripped his body for the last 10 minutes finally started to ease. Miriam stepped closer. "You okay?" Omari gave a small, tired nod. "Yeah, you handled that well. I shouldn't have had to handle it at all." Miriam's lips pressed together, but she didn't disagree. Finch cleared his throat. "Mr. Qasim, again, I sincerely apologize. If you'd like to file a complaint, I'd be happy to assist." Omari shook his head. "No need." Finch blinked, clearly surprised. "No." Omari's voice was even. "This is going to be handled in a different way." Finch didn't ask what he meant. He didn't have to, because the world was already watching. By the time Omari walked out of the airport doors, the video was already online. Miriam hadn't wasted a second. Within minutes, the footage had been uploaded, clipped, and shared across multiple platforms. A video titled "Racial Profiling at LAX, Officer Harasses Innocent Man" was already gaining traction. Omari barely had time to take a breath before his phone started vibrating. First a text from his business partner. "This is blowing up, man. You good?" Then a call. A journalist from a major news outlet wanted a statement. Omari let out a slow breath. He hadn't planned on this. He had only wanted to get home. But now this was bigger than him. Miriam walked beside him as they headed toward the pickup area. "The clip's at 50,000 views already," she said, checking her phone. "Give it a few hours and it'll hit 6 figures. Omari ran a hand over his face. "I didn't even do anything." That's exactly why people are mad. She wasn't wrong. The comments were already rolling in. "This is why we need accountability in law enforcement. How many times has he done this before and gotten away with it? Props to the guy for keeping his cool. I wouldn't have. Fire him. Period." Omari exhaled sharply. He wasn't the first person this had happened to. The only difference, this time, people saw it. Meanwhile, Kearney was drowning. The police department issued a statement within the hour, calling the incident deeply concerning and promising a full internal review. But that wasn't enough to stop the outrage. Reporters started digging into Kearney's past. By the next morning, someone had found 2 prior complaints against him for excessive force. Both swept under the rug. Now they were back in the light. Omari's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some wanted an interview. Others wanted a lawsuit. Civil rights groups were already drafting statements. And then, the real fallout. By midday, Officer Grant Kearney was suspended pending investigation. Omari stared at the headline on his screen, feeling, what? Relief? Satisfaction? No, not really. Because he knew what would happen next. The police union would fight for Kearney. Some news stations would try to spin it. People online would argue over what Omari should have done differently. And Kearney, he'd probably pop up in another department a few towns over. That's how it always went. Miriam sat across from him at the airport cafe, watching him carefully. You okay? Omari tapped his phone against the table, staring at the screen. This changes things. Miriam raised an eyebrow. How? Omari met her gaze. Because now I have to decide what to do next. The power wasn't just in the video. It was in the choice. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. Omari sat in his car, staring at the screen of his phone. The news had moved fast, faster than he expected. His name was everywhere now, his face too, but this wasn't about him. Not really. He scrolled through the messages flooding his inbox, some from old college friends, some from strangers, people thanking him, sharing their own stories. This happened to me last year at an airport in Phoenix. I filed a complaint, and nothing came of it. My brother went through the same thing, but he wasn't as lucky. They arrested him for resisting. Thank you for standing your ground. We all see this too often. Omari let out a slow breath. He had options. He could do an interview, go on a podcast, maybe even take legal action. But what would that change? He glanced out the window at the traffic moving along Century Boulevard, the constant rhythm of a city that never stopped. Miriam's voice still echoed in his mind. You handled that well, but had he? Or had he just survived it? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, then started typing. I wasn't looking for a fight today. I was just trying to get home. But that's the thing about moments like this. They remind you that staying silent won't stop it from happening again. This wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, if we keep the cameras rolling, keep the pressure on, and keep demanding change, one day it will be. He hit post. And just like that, the story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone watching. Because awareness wasn't enough anymore. It was time for accountability. This happens more than we think. And too often the people on the receiving end don't have a platform to fight back. If you believe in holding those in power accountable, keep the conversations going. Keep speaking up. Keep demanding better. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, share your story. Because the more we shine a light on injustice, the harder it becomes to ignore.